I showed you a video about your previous hearing before the Senate, I think. August 28, 2024, before a public hearing, you have stated that the Interpol should have coursed through that arrest before the Philippine courts. That was your position before. To avoid any legal issues later, the Interpol should have coursed through arrest before the Philippine courts. That was your position before. To avoid any legal issues later, and apparently it did not happen that way.
But when it comes to them going into the country, kung gusto nila pumasok dito upang manghuhuli at magpasagawa ng warrant na kanila pong na-issue po siguro ng ICC pagdating ng panahon, kailangan ho itong dumaan sa ating court system. Ito po ay kinakailangan ng isang action to enforce a warrant, action to enforce a judgment. Kailangan po dumaan yan sa ating court system. Kaya hindi ho namin pakikialaman kasi yan po trabaho na ng Interpol kung talagang gusto nilang habulin yung tao na nasasaktal. Yung sabihin natin, nag-issue po na warrant of arrest ng ICC, gusto mong enforce ng Interpol dito, pero para ho ito ay matuloy at hindi ho magkaroon ng kasuhan, kinakailangan pumunta muna sila sa korte natin. Yun po ang aming paningin.
Well, there are many laws involved when we look at a judgment of this nature or a judgment or a court order. The first thing we look at is the jurisdictional fact and whether or not there is jurisdiction. And in the Cayetano versus Pangilinan case, I think the Supreme Court, in an obiter, already stated that all things that happened prior to a certain date in 2019 are still within the jurisdiction of the ICC.
The ICC retains jurisdiction over crimes that were committed during the time that the withdrawing member state was still a member. Now, we pointed out something in our appeal brief. That is not exactly correct. The court must retain jurisdiction at the time that its exercise of that jurisdiction is called upon. So it's not enough that the crimes were committed during the time that the withdrawing member state was still a member. It must also be important to note that at the time you will exercise that jurisdiction, that member state was still a member. All right. So in our particular case, the request by the ICC prosecutor to commence his investigation, that triggered the exercise of jurisdiction by the ICC. And when was that? That was already in September of 2021. Our withdrawal had become effective in March of 2019, Karen. So at the time that the exercise of jurisdiction was triggered, we were no longer a member of the ICC and we have no legal duty anymore to cooperate.
So that's one thing that consider.
Cayetano, what is that?
Pangilinan.
So we can look, you are now looking at that things, those precedents.
Well, there are other things that affect it. The Republic Act 9851, the international humanitarian law, our adherence to international humanitarian law is the law in the case now, and that will be for us to argue with the to bring out in the Supreme Court, because it's a matter that defines and redefines cases of this nature.
Just jurisdiction, the period of when crimes are committed, isn't that the area of jurisdiction?
Well, the area of jurisdiction is one thing. When you will exercise that jurisdiction is another thing. Well, the area of jurisdiction is one thing. When you will exercise that jurisdiction is another thing. That's what we're saying in the appeal brief. At the time that you were called upon to exercise that jurisdiction, we were not a member anymore. So that exercise of jurisdiction must concur with the requirement that the offense or the crime, subject matter of the investigation, was committed during the time that the member state was still a member.
Okay, so what you're talking about is the exercise.
Exercise.
That's the different. That's the
Correct.
difference. The jurisdiction is not a time frame. What you're talking about is exercising.
Exercise of
You
that.
believe you still have to be within the ICC for them to exercise that.
Correct.